I was 32 years old when my 8-year-old son handed me a photograph that made my father's face turn white with terror. What my late mother had hidden in that frame would expose a secret so devastating that it would destroy the man who spent years telling me I'd never be good enough. My name is Maya Chen, and for 17 years I believed I was the problem in my family. I believed that every harsh word, every cruel comparison, every moment of rejection was somehow deserved. I thought I really was just like my mother in all the worst ways my father claimed. But that photograph changed everything, and I'm about to tell you how an innocent child became the messenger that would finally set me free. Let me paint you a picture of my family, because understanding who these people were makes what happened next so much more powerful. My father, Robert Chen, is 58 years old and looks exactly like what you'd expect from a successful businessman. Sharp suits, commanding presence, the kind of man who walks into a room and immediately takes control. He built a marketing firm from nothing and turned it into $1 million company. Everyone in our town respects him, sees him as this pillar of the community. But behind closed doors, Robert had perfected the art of psychological warfare, and his favorite target was always me. Then there's Diane, my stepmother, who's 45 but tries desperately to look 35. She married my father when I was just 16 years old, barely a year after my mother died from cancer. Diane has this perfectly manicured life, this Instagram-worthy house, and this sweet public persona that fools everyone. But when no one's watching, she has a talent for delivering the kind of cutting remarks that stay with you for years. She always spoke to me like I was some charity case they'd reluctantly taken in. My son Lucas is 8 years old, and he's honestly the light of my life. After my divorce 2 years ago, it's been just me and him against the world. Lucas has these big, curious eyes and this innocent way of asking questions that sometimes cuts right to the heart of things adults try to avoid. He's the kind of kid who notices everything but doesn't always understand what he's seeing. That combination of observation and innocence would prove to be exactly what our family needed. And then there was my mother, Sarah Chen, who died when I was 15. In my father's version of history, Sarah was weak, irresponsible, and basically the source of every problem our family ever had. According to Robert, she was careless with money, emotional to a fault, and just generally not good enough for the life he was trying to build. For 17 years, every time I made a mistake, showed emotion, or failed to meet his impossible standards, I heard the same refrain. "You're just like your mother, Maya. You'll never be good enough." I grew up believing that being compared to my mother was the worst insult possible. I spent my entire adult life trying to be everything she supposedly wasn't. I became organized, controlled, financially responsible, emotionally reserved. I thought if I could just be different enough from her memory, maybe my father would finally see me as worthy of his love and respect. But here's what I didn't know, what none of us knew, was that my mother had left behind something that would completely shatter the narrative my father had built around her death. Hidden in a picture frame that should have been thrown away years ago was proof that everything I'd been told about my mother, about myself, about our family, was a lie, designed to protect the most selfish man I've ever known. The day Lucas found that frame, the day he innocently walked up to my father during one of his typical verbal attacks and said those words, "Grandma told me to give this to you when you say those words again," was the day 17 years of carefully constructed lies came crashing down. What my father saw in that frame didn't just expose his secrets. It revealed that every cruel word he'd ever spoken about my mother was actually a confession of his own guilt. And every time he told me I'd never be good enough, he was really just trying to make sure I never discovered the truth about who the real failure in our family had always been. This is the story of how a child's innocent discovery became the key that unlocked a prison I didn't even know I was living in. The drive to my childhood home always filled me with this familiar knot of anxiety in my stomach. Even at 32, even as a successful marketing coordinator with my own apartment and my own life, I still felt like that insecure 16-year-old girl every time I pulled into that pristine driveway. It was Lucas's 8th birthday, and despite every instinct telling me to celebrate somewhere else, I'd agreed to have dinner at my father's house. Lucas barely knew his grandfather, which honestly was probably for the best, but I kept hoping that maybe seeing his grandson would soften Robert. Somehow. Maybe becoming a grandfather would unlock some capacity for love that had been missing when I was growing up. The house looked exactly the same as it had for the past 17 years. Diane had redecorated everything the moment she moved in, erasing every trace of my mother's presence with surgical precision. The walls that once held family photos with my mom were now covered in Diane's expensive abstract art. The cozy reading nook where my mother used to curl up with her books had been replaced with some minimalist furniture that looked beautiful but felt cold and untouchable. Walking through that front door was like stepping into a museum of everything I'd lost. Not just my mother, but the warmth that had once filled those rooms. After my mother died, it was like someone had turned down the emotional temperature of the entire house permanently. Lucas bounced ahead of me, excited about his birthday dinner, completely unaware of the tension I carried in my shoulders. That's one of the things I love most about him, his ability to find joy in simple moments. But it also made me incredibly protective. I never wanted him to experience the casual cruelty that had shaped my own childhood. "Maya, you're late," were the first words out of my father's mouth. Not hello, not happy birthday, Lucas, just immediate criticism. It was 6:03 and we'd agreed on 6:00. 3 minutes and already I was failing to meet his standards. Diane emerged from the kitchen wearing one of her perfectly pressed outfits, the kind that somehow never seemed to wrinkle or stain despite cooking dinner. She gave Lucas a brief hug and handed him a gift bag, then turned to me with that smile she'd perfected over the years. Sweet enough that strangers would think she was being kind, but cold enough that I knew exactly where I stood. "I made your favorite," she announced, which would have been thoughtful if she'd actually made my favorite instead of the salmon dish she knew I'd stopped eating years ago after developing an allergy. But pointing that out would just create drama, so I thanked her and helped Lucas wash his hands. The dining room table was set with Diane's wedding china, the expensive set she'd registered for when she married my father. Everything was perfect, coordinated, exactly the kind of entertaining setup you'd see in a home magazine. The only thing missing was any sense that real people actually live there. As we sat down to dinner, I found myself falling into old patterns. I sat up straighter, spoke more carefully, monitored every word before it left my mouth. It's exhausting, spending an entire meal trying to be perfect enough to avoid criticism. But after 17 years of practice, it had become automatic. Lucas chattered happily about school, about his friends, about the new video game he'd been wanting. Robert listened with the kind of polite attention you'd give a stranger's child, nodding occasionally but never really engaging. It struck me how different this was from how my mother used to be with me. She would ask follow-up questions, get excited about my stories, make me feel like everything I said mattered. "Can I explore the house after dinner?" Lucas asked, and I saw Robert's jaw tighten slightly. "Just stay out of the attic," Robert said firmly. "There's nothing up there but old junk, and it's not safe for children." I should have paid more attention to that warning. I should have noticed the look that passed between Robert and Diane when Lucas asked about exploring, but I was too focused on trying to navigate the dinner conversation without triggering one of my father's lectures about my shortcomings. The conversation flowed in its predictable patterns. Robert talked about work, about his latest business success, about clients who respected his expertise. Diane talked about her yoga classes, her book club, the charity events that kept her social calendar full. And I sat there, contributing just enough to seem engaged while feeling increasingly invisible. This was my normal. This was what family dinner had looked like for 17 years. Polite, surface level, carefully controlled to avoid any real emotional connection. I had no idea that in just a few hours, Lucas would stumble upon something that would blow this carefully maintained facade apart completely. Looking back now, I can see that the tension in that room wasn't just about my father's usual disappointment in me. There was something else, something I couldn't identify at the time. Robert and Diane were more on edge than usual, more protective of their space, more insistent that Lucas stay in the designated areas of the house. They were guarding something, and my innocent son was about to find exactly what they'd been hiding. Everything fell apart over a glass of red wine. We'd made it through most of dinner without incident, which honestly felt like a small miracle. Lucas had opened his presents, we'd sung happy birthday, and I was actually starting to relax. Maybe this visit would be different. Maybe we could get through one family gathering without the usual emotional warfare. I should have known better. I was reaching across the table to refill my father's water glass when my elbow caught the stem of my wine glass. It happened in slow motion, the way disasters always do. The glass tipped, deep red wine cascading across Diane's pristine white tablecloth like blood spreading through bandages. The silence that followed was deafening. Lucas looked up from his birthday cake with wide eyes, immediately sensing the shift in atmosphere. I grabbed my napkin, started dabbing at the stain, apologizing profusely. "I'm so sorry, Diane. I can pay for dry cleaning or replace it completely. I'm really sorry. I don't know how that happened." But I could see in my father's face that sorry wasn't going to be enough. His jaw was set in that familiar way, his eyes cold and calculating. He was building up to something, and I knew from experience that when Robert decided to unleash his anger, it was devastating. "This is exactly what I'm talking about, Maya." His voice was quiet, controlled, which somehow made it more terrifying than yelling would have been. "This is exactly the kind of careless, thoughtless behavior that I've been dealing with your entire life." I felt my stomach drop. Here it came. The familiar litany of my failures, the crushing weight of his disappointment. But something was different this time. Maybe it was turning 32, maybe it was becoming a mother myself, but I could feel something shifting inside me. "Dad, it was an accident. I'll take care of the tablecloth." An accident. He said the word like it tasted bitter. "Everything's always an accident with you, isn't it, Maya? Just like it was always an accident with your mother." Sarah was exactly the same way. Careless, clumsy, never thinking about how her actions affected other people. My hand stilled on the napkin. He was bringing up my mother, which always meant he was about to go nuclear. "You'll never be good enough, Maya. You're following right in her footsteps. Sarah was a disaster, and you're proving every day that the apple doesn't fall far from the tree." Diane jumped in then, like she always did, adding her particular brand of cruelty to the mix. "Honestly, Maya, you should be thankful we let you in this house at all. Most fathers wouldn't put up with this level of disappointment. Most stepmothers certainly wouldn't." She said it with that same sweet smile she used with her book club friends, but her words hit like physical blows. I could feel Lucas watching this exchange, trying to understand why the adults were being so mean to his mommy. And something in me just snapped. "Don't you dare talk about my mother like that," I said, standing up from the table. My voice was shaking, but it was steady. "My mother was loving and kind and everything good about my childhood. She would never speak to someone the way you both just spoke to me." Robert's face darkened. I'd crossed a line by defending Sarah, by challenging his version of history. "Your mother was weak, Maya. She was irresponsible, and frankly, I'm glad she's gone. At least I don't have to deal with two failures anymore." The words hung in the air like poison gas. Even Diane looked shocked at the viciousness of what he'd just said. Lucas had gone completely still, his fork halfway to his mouth, staring at his grandfather with an expression I'd never seen before. "How dare you?" I whispered. "How dare you say that about the woman who loved you, who took care of you, who died while you were already planning your future with someone else?" I hadn't meant to say that last part. It just slipped out, this suspicion I'd carried for years but never voiced. The timing of Diane's appearance in our lives had always felt wrong, too convenient, too quick. Robert stood up so fast his chair nearly fell over. "You don't know what you're talking about. You were just a child. You have no idea what your mother was really like, what I had to put up with." "I know she loved me unconditionally, which is more than I can say for you." The room felt like it was vibrating with 17 years of suppressed anger and hurt. This was it. The confrontation I'd been avoiding my entire adult life. But before Robert could respond, before this could escalate into the screaming match that would probably end with me grabbing Lucas and leaving forever, something completely unexpected happened. Lucas stood up from his chair, walked over to the corner where he'd left his backpack, and pulled out an old picture frame I'd never seen before. The silence that followed Lucas standing up was different from the tense quiet we'd been drowning in. This was the kind of silence that happens when a child enters an adult conversation they don't fully understand, but somehow know is important. My 8-year-old son walked across that dining room with the quiet confidence that only children possess when they believe they're doing something right. In his small hands was an old picture frame, the kind with ornate silver edges that had definitely seen better years. I'd never seen it before in my life, but something about it felt familiar in a way I couldn't place. "Grandpa Robert," Lucas said, his voice clear and innocent, "Grandma Sarah told me to give this to you when you say those mean words about Mommy again." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Robert's face went from flushed with anger to completely pale in the space of a heartbeat. Diane's perfectly composed expression cracked just for a second before she forced that sweet smile back into place. "Lucas, honey," I said, my voice still shaky from the confrontation, "you never met Grandma Sarah. She died before you were born." But Lucas just looked at me with those big, serious eyes of his. "I know, Mommy, but she told me anyway, when I was looking in the attic." "You were in the attic?" Robert's voice came out as barely more than a whisper, but there was something in it I'd never heard before. Fear. "I'm sorry," Lucas said quickly, clearly sensing he'd done something wrong. "I know you said not to go up there, but I was looking for the bathroom and I opened the wrong door and saw the stairs. There were all these boxes with pictures and stuff, and this frame was sitting right on top of one of them, like someone wanted me to find it." Diane stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the hardwood floor. "Lucas, sweetheart, sometimes children imagine things. Sometimes our minds play tricks on us." But Lucas shook his head firmly. "I wasn't imagining. Grandma Sarah was really pretty, and she had the same eyes as Mommy. She told me that Grandpa Robert gets mean sometimes because he's sad, but that this picture would help him remember how to be nice again." I felt goosebumps rise on my arms. Lucas was describing my mother with perfect accuracy, down to the eyes we shared. But that was impossible. He'd never even seen a photograph of her. Robert and Diane had made sure of that. "Lucas," I said gently, "what exactly did Grandma Sarah tell you?" "She said that grown-ups sometimes forget important things, and that when Grandpa Robert starts saying mean things about you or about her, I should give him this picture to help him remember. She said it would make everything better." Robert was staring at the frame in Lucas's hands like it might explode. His fingers were actually trembling, and a thin line of sweat had appeared on his forehead despite the air conditioning. "She also said," Lucas continued, completely unaware of the adult's growing panic, "that there's something special hiding behind the picture that would help Mommy understand why Grandpa Robert gets so angry all the time." "Give me that frame." Robert's voice was sharp now, desperate. He reached for it, but Lucas stepped back instinctively. "Grandma Sarah said to give it to you, but only so you could give it to Mommy. She said Mommy deserves to know the truth." The word truth hung in the air like a bomb waiting to go off. Diane had gone completely white, her hands gripping the back of her chair so tightly her knuckles showed. "There's nothing in that frame except an old picture," she said, but her voice was too high, too forced. "Lucas is just confused." But I was starting to understand that Lucas wasn't confused at all. Something had guided him to that attic, to that specific frame, at this exact moment when 17 years of lies were already cracking apart. "What truth, baby?" I asked, kneeling down to Lucas's level. "What did Grandma Sarah say Mommy deserves to know?" Lucas looked back and forth between his grandfather's terrified face and his grandmother Diane's fake smile, sensing the tension even if he couldn't fully understand it. "She said that the picture would show you who really wasn't good enough," Lucas said simply, "and it wasn't you or her." Robert made a sound like all the air had been knocked out of his lungs. Without another word, he lunged for the frame, but I was faster. Years of protecting my son had taught me to move quickly when I sensed danger, and every instinct I had was screaming that this frame, whatever it contained, was the key to everything. I took it from Lucas's hands and looked at Robert's face, really looked at it, and saw something I'd never seen before. Pure, absolute terror. My hands were shaking as I held the frame, feeling the weight of 17 years of lies in my palms. The silver edges were tarnished with age, and I could see that the back had been carefully opened and resealed multiple times. Whatever was hidden behind this photograph, someone had accessed it before. "Maya, please," Robert said, his voice breaking in a way I'd never heard. "Just give me the frame." "You don't understand what you're doing." But I did understand. For the first time in my adult life, I finally understood that my father's cruelty wasn't about my failures. It was about his fear of this moment, this exact moment when his carefully constructed lies would come crashing down. I turned the frame over and began working at the small metal clasps that held the backing in place. My fingers were clumsy with adrenaline, but I could feel something rustling behind the photograph, papers that shouldn't have been there. "Stop," Diane commanded, her sweet facade completely gone now. "Maya, some things are better left buried. Your mother is gone. What's the point in digging up old pain?" "The point," I said, finally getting the first clasp open, "is that I've spent my entire adult life believing I was the problem. The point is that I've let you both convince me that being like my mother was the worst thing I could possibly be." The second clasp gave way, and I could see the edge of folded papers behind my parents' wedding photo. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. "Maya, I'm warning you," Robert said, but his voice had no authority left in it. He sounded like a man watching his execution. I lifted the photograph out of the frame, and 3 things fell onto Diane's pristine white tablecloth: a folded letter in my mother's handwriting, a smaller photograph, and a receipt from a private investigator dated 6 months before my mother died. I picked up the smaller photograph first, and the world tilted sideways. It was Robert and Diane, but not the way I'd ever seen them together. This was clearly taken during his marriage to my mother. They were at some restaurant holding hands across a table, looking at each other the way people look when they're completely in love. Diane was wearing a necklace I recognized because she still wore it, a distinctive silver heart that Robert had supposedly given her for their first anniversary. "You were having an affair," I whispered, the pieces finally clicking into place. "You were having an affair with Diane while Mom was sick." "Maya, let me explain," Robert started, but I was already unfolding the letter. My mother's handwriting was shaky, probably from the chemotherapy, but her words were crystal clear. "My dearest Maya, if you're reading this, it means your father is still trying to rewrite history to make himself the hero of our story. I hired a private investigator because I suspected Robert was cheating, but I never imagined it was with the woman he claimed was just helping him cope with my illness. This photo was taken 3 months after my cancer diagnosis, when he told me he needed space to process his grief. He wasn't processing grief, baby. He was planning his future without me. When I confronted him with this evidence, he told me I was a pathetic, worthless woman who would die alone and forgotten. He said no one would ever believe me over him, and that if I told anyone, he would make sure you never saw a penny of inheritance or family support. He said he was only staying until I died to keep up appearances. Maya, every cruel thing he has ever said about me being weak, being irresponsible, being not good enough, is projection. I was strong enough to fight cancer and his betrayal simultaneously. I was responsible enough to document his lies. And I was more than good enough, which is why he had to destroy my memory to live with what he did. You are not like me in the ways he claims. You are like me in the ways that matter. You are brave, you are worthy, and you deserve love that doesn't come with conditions or cruelty. Don't let him convince you otherwise. I love you forever, Mom. The silence in that room was absolute. Even Lucas had stopped moving, sensing that something monumental was happening. I looked up at Robert, and for the first time in my life, I saw him clearly. Not as the powerful, successful man who had intimidated me for decades, but as a coward who had spent 17 years tearing down his own daughter to protect his guilty conscience. "You destroyed her," I said, my voice steady now, "and then you spent 17 years trying to destroy me, so I would never figure out what you had done." Robert's face crumpled, and Diane bolted for the door. The sound of Diane's car peeling out of the driveway broke the spell that had fallen over the dining room. Robert was still sitting there, his head in his hands, looking smaller than I'd ever seen him. For 17 years, this man had loomed over my life like a giant, and now he just looked like what he'd always been, a broken, selfish person who had destroyed 2 women to hide from his own shame. "Daddy, why is Grandpa Robert crying?" Lucas asked, tugging on my sleeve. His innocent question cut through the heavy silence. I looked down at my son, this brave little boy who had somehow become the messenger my mother needed him to be, and I realized that he had just witnessed something that would change our family forever. But instead of trauma, I saw curiosity in his eyes. Children are incredibly resilient when they feel safe, and Lucas knew he was safe with me. "Sometimes grown-ups cry when they realize they've made big mistakes," I told him, gathering up the letter and photograph with hands that were finally steady. "We're going to go home now, okay?" But before I could leave, Robert finally looked up. His face was red and blotchy, nothing like the composed businessman who had spent decades intimidating me. "Maya, please," he said, his voice hoarse. "Let me explain. Let me try to make this right." I stared at him for a long moment, this man who had shaped my entire understanding of my own worth. "Make it right?" I repeated. "Dad, you spent 17 years convincing me that I was fundamentally flawed. You made me believe that every time I showed emotion, every time I made a mistake, every time I failed to be perfect, I was proving that I was just like my mother in all the worst ways." "I was protecting you," he said weakly. "I was trying to make you stronger." "You were protecting yourself," I corrected. "Every time you called me careless like Mom, you were really talking about how she was careless enough to trust you. Every time you said I'd never be good enough, you were really confessing that you were the one who wasn't good enough for her love." Robert flinched like I'd slapped him. "She was going to die anyway, Maya. The cancer was going to take her regardless of what I did." "But you took her dignity. You took her peace. You made her final months about hiding your betrayal instead of letting her focus on fighting for her life and spending time with me." I stood up, Lucas's small hand finding mine. "And then you spent 17 years making sure I never discovered what kind of man you really were by convincing me I was the problem." "Where are you going?" Robert asked as I started toward the door. "Home," I said simply. "To my real life with my son, away from all of this. Maya, you're still my daughter. We're still family." I stopped at the doorway and turned back one last time. "No, Dad. A family is built on love and truth and support. What we had was a dictatorship built on lies and fear. I'm done being afraid of disappointing you." 6 months later, I was sitting in my therapist's office holding that same letter from my mother. Dr. Rodriguez had helped me understand that trauma doesn't just disappear when you discover the truth, but that the truth gives you the power to heal. "How do you feel about your mother now?" she asked during one of our sessions. "Like I want to be exactly like her," I said, and meant it. "She was strong enough to document the truth, even while she was dying. She was loving enough to protect me from the immediate pain, while making sure I'd eventually learn what really happened. She was brave enough to confront my father even when she was at her most vulnerable. I'd also reconnected with my mother's sister, my Aunt Jennifer, who had been shut out of our lives after my mother died. She told me stories about my mother that I'd never heard, stories about her kindness, her humor, her fierce protective love for me. "Your mom used to say you had an old soul," Jennifer told me over coffee. "She said you saw things other people missed, just like you're doing now." But the most healing moment came 3 weeks ago, when Lucas asked me to tell him about Grandma Sarah while we were making dinner together. "She sounds really nice, Mommy," he said, after I'd shared some of Jennifer's stories. "I'm glad I got to help her give you that picture." "Do you remember talking to her in the attic?" I asked. Lucas thought for a moment, his face serious. "Not exactly talking. It was more like knowing. Like when you know you should help someone even though no one told you to." I hugged him tight, understanding that some things can't be explained, only accepted with gratitude. Today, my mother's letter sits framed on my mantle, right next to a photo of her holding baby me in the hospital. Every morning when Lucas and I eat breakfast, he asks about the pretty lady in the picture, and I get to tell him about his grandmother, Sarah, who was strong and loving and absolutely good enough. And every time I look in the mirror, instead of seeing my father's disappointment reflected back at me, I see my mother's eyes and remember that being like her isn't an insult. It's the greatest compliment I could ever receive. If this story touched your heart, you're not alone. Sometimes the truth we need most is hidden right in front of us, waiting for the right moment to set us free. And sometimes that moment comes through the most unexpected messengers. To everyone watching who has ever been told they're not good enough or that they're just like someone in a negative way, remember that the people who say these things are often projecting their own shame and failures onto you. Your worth isn't determined by someone else's inability to see your value. If you found hope in Maya's story, please hit that like button to help others who might need to hear this message find it too. Share this video with someone who needs a reminder of their own strength. And don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell because we share real stories about real people finding their way back to themselves every single week. Drop a comment below and tell me, have you ever discovered a truth that completely changed how you saw your family or yourself? Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear. Until next time, remember that you are worthy of love, respect, and the truth. And sometimes, the greatest compliment you can receive is being compared to someone whose memory others tried to diminish. See you in the next story.